Hey, Bike Utah. My name is Brian Ellison. I'm a strength and bike coach here at Minerstown up in Park City. And here with my colleague Alex to talk to you about your questions today and kind of frame up being in the gym and riding at the same time and why they work together really well.
So, as Brian said, my name is Alex Wetmore. I'm also a strength conditioning coach here at Minerstown. I have a PhD in sport physiology and performance, so I'm excited to jump into some of the questions that we've got from you guys.
Yeah. So maybe Alex, if it's okay with you, maybe we start this about why would I want to lift and ride at the same time
Sure.
in terms of because there's a lot of fact, there's a lot of fiction around
Mhm.
that. So maybe we start there.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
So I get this question all the time, whether it be from cyclists or Nordic skiers or runners or whatever it may be. And the short question to that, or the short answer to that question, is basically that it's all about balancing your total workload and fatigue levels. And by incorporating strength training, you're able to do a few things that really help elevate your performance. One of those is obviously you increase your force production, so that allows you to put much more force into the pedal every stroke. And that can have an effect whether it's on uphill climbs or just total volume of training, right? The second is that strength training has a huge impact on tissue resilience. So we've seen very consistently across the scientific literature that properly designed strength training has a very protective effect on tissue health. So we've all either had an injury ourselves from doing prolonged training, or we've known somebody that has just had something pop up and then they have to take a ton of time off of training. So strength training can be a good strategy to try to mitigate some of those things. And then lastly, a properly designed strength program includes a lot of mobility and warm up and some form of plyometric training. So it can do a lot just from your general movement quality. So you're not just doing such repetitive movements every day and neglecting other aspects of your fitness.
Totally agree on all that, and looking forward to building that out a little more here. A
Mm-hmm.
couple of things I would add on, and well, related, and maybe adding on a little bit is, yeah, I mean there are research studies that show that you're going to be more efficient on the bike.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you're going to produce more watts with less effort
Mm-hmm.
if you're stronger, right? And certainly there are some things you can do on the bike to get stronger, but in my opinion, the most efficient way to do it is by lifting,
Yeah.
right? And to your point, you're also then avoiding some overuse injuries and things like that,
Yeah.
right?
I've gotten a question like that many times, and the way I explain it to somebody is if you consider, let's just make it as simple as possible, just one pedal stroke requires a certain level of force, right? Somebody who's pretty weak, let's say it takes 30 units of force and they can only produce 50 units, then they're operating pretty close to their maximum strength every time they push into that pedal. But
Yeah.
if you can produce 100 units of force, now you've been able to increase your movement economy so much you're not exerting yourself every time you do a repetitive movement.
Right. And we see this dynamic going on with triathletes and runners as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? So people, and this isn't just short distance, people who are doing merit, they're finding for the same reasons you just talked about that they need to be lifting for the exact same reasons, right?
Yep.
So, if I'm a biker doing long distances, it's equally applicable,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Um, now, what about we hear this too? Oh, if I start lifting, I'm gonna get all big and bulky, right?
Yeah.
I think that's another kind of myth to explore and quite candidly debunk here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about that?
So my first reaction to that is always that we have this principle in strength conditioning called the SAID principle. So specificity of adaptation to implied demands. So if I wanted somebody to gain size through training, I could design a program to do that. But in this case, that would not be our goal. So a properly designed program is not going to cause a response that we're not looking for that isn't going to help you in your sport.
Right,
Uh,
right,
there are also a few different things that affect how much size or like bulk you might put on. Oftentimes that's effective most by genetics. And those who are really good on a bike are oftentimes not the same genetic profile of somebody that's going to end up, weighing 270 pounds and be a power lifter.
Right. Right.
Secondarily, the volume of work that you're doing both in the gym and out of the gym has a huge effect on that. So people who are spending a lot of time in an elevated heart rate zone outside of gym work are triggering the cellular signaling pathway that kind of directly fights the one which builds a lot of size.
Right.
So if
Right.
you're training a lot on the bike, then you're probably, even if you were training high volume in a gym, are not going to find that response physically.
Right, exactly. And I think kind of again outside biking, but to reinforce what you're saying, I think another example of that is if you look at Olympic lifters,
Mm-hmm.
right? Per kilogram of body weight, they are doing incredible amounts of weight.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not the same body type that you're going to see at a bodybuilding contest or a strong person contest.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because of how they're lifting and what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
You may even look at some of these people as, wow, they look kind of lean, but the force they can produce per pound of body weight is amazing. And that's exactly where we want to get to in terms of the metrics with our biking too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So then we get another kind of related question to that. Hopefully I think we can move on from that. Is that yes, you can feel very comfortable lifting weights and sleep well at night without thinking you're going to turn into the next version of the Incredible Hulk, right? But then there's a question, oh, like how many reps do I need? Do I have to do 10 to 12 reps with everything? And I'll kind of run on with that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the answer is no, right? But the answer is maybe yes. And the answer is really, it depends on where you're at in your training program. The best thing you can do is have a training program that matches what your training on the bike is. And hopefully they go hand in glove. So and we call this periodization. And there may be a point in time during probably your off season, actually, where you are doing 10 to 12 reps on some things, right? But as you get more into what we call the preseason or in season, the odds of you doing 10 to 12 reps are very, very low because you want to transition toward, through a couple phases, one of which is we call maximum strength, right? And you're not building maximum strength at 10 to 12 reps. It's more like 3 to 5 reps. You also want to get into power. So how fast can I move something? Again, with power, you're not doing 10 to 12 reps either. So the overall answer is, so you may be doing 10 to 12 reps at some point of something, but throughout the year, no, you are not, because you need to be following certain periodized benchmarks about how to build through the year. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. A well-designed periodized program is always directional. So you have a starting point and an end point, whether that's based on a timeline for an event or it's simply what quality you want to have by a certain, kind of period of your year. So you might be doing higher reps at one part of the year, it's important, but you're always trying to modify those variables of programs so that you end up in a program that is matching what you're doing on the bike.
absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. I think that parlays well then into then how do I combine my biking and my lifting, right? Such that we hear about how those things can potentially conflict with each other sometimes in terms of some signaling pathways, or just dang, I'm feeling super tired and
Mm-hmm.
this is really weighing me down. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I touched on this real briefly earlier, but I think what we're really boiling down to is how we manage our workload and our fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's probably the most questioned part of this is how do I have enough time and enough energy to do them
Yeah.
both, and will one of them take away from the other? So really what you have to determine is during each time period, what level of fatigue are you expecting? Because there are going to be times in the year when you're training here in the gym and when you're doing a lot of general prep work on the bike where we expect you to be fatigued. That is not something to be alarmed at because it's kind of what is driving the response we want from training. Now, there are other times in the year where we're trying to maximize what we call readiness outside doing whatever rather than being ready only to train in a gym. So we would expect your response from the gym training to not cause a lot of undue fatigue. But basically, the idea is that we should have an idea of how we expect you to feel after training, and then we can modify based on if you are following our expected outcomes. So if done well, you're going to be able to plan for off days, both in the gym and outside, plan for light days in the gym and offside, and plan for heavy days where we really try to drive that fatigue so that they match well together and you're able to still get everything done.
Yeah, yeah, agree. I think, in terms of fatigue, I think there's a couple. Well, one is like, wait, when you wake up in the morning, hey, how do I feel?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then there are all these wearables, of which I have one as well. I use HRV pretty religiously now. Is it the end all be all? No, but I have found that getting my HRV, that's heart rate variability, by the way, is also a good measure of just what my body
Mm-hmm.
is kind of capable of doing. And you kind of learn. Oh, it takes a while to kind of get your body dialed in on that. And then there's some kind of rules of thumb on the bike and the weight. Well, general, like in my opinion, make your hard days hard, make your easy days easy,
Mm-hmm.
right?
It's what we call polarized training.
Exactly, right? So we end up spending too much time in that dirty middle where you're not working hard enough to get the adaptations, and you're not working easy enough to give your body the break that it needs.
Mm-hmm.
Couple of other biking centric things, I think, like, you need to be careful. Like, are you going to do heavy lifting and say a threshold or a VO2 max workout, on the same day? That's kind of, that's an individual type thing. And you want to probably prioritize what is the biking the priority, or is the lifting the priority? And then there is a fair amount of science then that you probably want about 5 hours in between those sessions,
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to do that. Personally, what I found that works for me is if I'm doing twice in a day, I'll do an easy ride in the morning, kind of an endurance ride, and then I'll lift in the afternoon,
Yeah.
right? And then kind of another rule of thumb, especially for masters type athletes, you probably don't need more than two high intensity biking sessions per week. And you probably don't need more than two high intensity weightlifting sessions per week if you're in full season. And
Mm-hmm.
it takes a while to kind of get that schedule kind of put together, and we do that with people a lot. But just some benchmarks to think about. Hey, how do I organize all this? You got to organize it around your life for sure, and then you got to be able to organize it around your body so that you're driving hard enough but not too hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a quick tag along on that. Um, there's also always the opportunity to modify your training based on how you're feeling. So if you get
Right.
up in the morning and you check those wearables, or you're finishing up your morning ride and you're trying to evaluate how you feel for the afternoon, there are some things you can do to try to make decisions so that you're still getting the targeted outcome. So
Right.
the first thing I tell everybody is, as when you get into the gym, you should be present in your warm up. It's not just, hop on a bike for 5 minutes, do a couple stretches and go. You should be thinking the whole time, how do I feel as compared to normal? Do I feel like there's any sort of limited range mobility I should work on before I actually get into lifting? Do I feel like I am fresh enough to have an intensity to my training? And those can start to answer some questions for you
Yeah.
while you come in. So for people that are really, really consistent in their training and they like to track data, sometimes we will recommend you have some form of standard movement that you test while you are in the gym. So oftentimes the movement people choose is to do like a vertical jump. So then they get kind of a trend score of how they're responding to training. And if you're seeing multiple days in a row where your vertical jump is kind of trending downwards, it might be time to modify your training a bit and allow for some more recovery. A lot of people use like grip strength for the same thing because it's highly indicative
Yeah.
of neuromuscular fatigue.
Right.
So There are
Right.
some different strategies you can use for that, but the take-home point is to truly be present and evaluate how you're feeling as you go through your warm-up.
Yeah, so a couple things about that related on the bike then too. So if you're well dialed into your heart rate zones, and your power zones, if you're going for a pretty hard ride and you are just not hitting the zones that you're targeting, you can't get there,
Mm-hmm.
then that's probably a sign that you know. And this is kind of the fine line. There are days when you can kind of push through it, but then there's days where you just got to call it and step away, right?
Yeah.
Or, oh, hey, I'm trying to get up into zone 4 and zone 5 and my heart rate's not moving. Again, that could be a sign that you're just not ready for the day, and which is fine,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's better to take that rest, right, and recover than kind of start getting into overreaching and
Mm-hmm.
potentially some overtraining.
Yeah, I had
So
a professor in my master's program that said he would rather have his personal athletes 80% undertrained as compared to 20% overtrained.
right,
Now I think he's
right,
using a little bit of hyperbole there,
yeah,
but the point hits home that you should pay attention to how you feel and don't be afraid to make the necessary changes to your training.
totally right. Yes, every day is its own day that you need to be able to have the tools to make a good decision on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of gets into then, hey, I'm doing this movement. Maybe I've been doing it a lot. Maybe it's new and it's hurting, right? Do I push through? And oftentimes we want to, oh, I'll get through it for just this day, or oh, I'm going to learn how to do this, and then it's not going to hurt. I'm going to get stronger. So, um, I would say those are probably not the right mindsets. Again, you want to be the best thing you can be able to do for your training is to be able to train consistently, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we're doing things to jeopardize the consistency of what we're doing, like trying to work through pain, we're putting that at risk. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we get this kind of a question, or we see this happening quite a bit. And my first response is always, if you're not sure if you're doing it right and it's hurting you, please ask us and we'll evaluate your technique. We'll work with you, because if it's simply a technical error, we can fix that quickly.
Right.
If pain is still persisting, then that tells us there is some sort of either tissue damage or structure damage that's causing that pain. And there are a ton of different ways to train in the gym, so it is always better to train around the injury and still hit the desired outcome of the session rather than try to push through an injury, which ultimately might take you out of the game for a little bit longer.
Right, right. And I love what you just said, is that it's not a 0 or a 1 in terms of, oh, I'm going to do this all the way or I'm not going to do it at all.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways you can keep moving without jeopardizing, your long-term ability to keep showing up.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So, yeah. That kind of gets into another topic, at least for me, because I'm old. And what I found is that for my rides, especially my big ride, my warm up has become more and more important in
Mm-hmm.
order to do well, and that's whether I'm training or racing.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that my warm up, it's not just getting on the bike and spinning around randomly, right? There are definitive kind of heart rate things I try and hit in the warm up, and then also kind of getting my whole body moving and activated. The mobility stuff that we talk about here in the gym has just made, for me, it's made a huge difference in my riding and my warm ups. Personally, my target areas are my back and my hips. Getting my hips really warmed up well is just, and then getting my glutes activated before I actually start spinning on the bike has just made a huge difference for me. So
Yeah. We could really get into the details on this particular topic for the entire video if we wanted to.
yeah,
But what you're referring to is something called short-term potentiation, where if you're able to, like you said, kind of activate the tissue you're hoping to use within the training session, it's a lot easier to recruit that same neural pathway. So when you get your hips feeling like they're ready to bike and then you get on the bike, that makes a difference in how you perform. And then the other part that I always add into this when we talk about warm-up is that warm up is volume we're accounting for in your training.
Mm-hmm.
So we want you to do a certain amount of work in the warm up, and that might be just adding in some extra time cycling or on a treadmill or just foam rolling or whatever it is. So if you're in a hurry and you're skipping that, then you're not actually hitting the volume we're planning for.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, this is probably our last topic, but the other thing kind of relating to getting ready to ride well then is, to me, fueling, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people think about fluids so I don't get dehydrated, and that's certainly important. But, another very key, your muscles don't fire unless unless they're loaded with enough carbohydrates or glucose from the carbohydrates or the fat. They don't work, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's an underappreciated connection of, why are Tour de France, riders consuming 120 grams of carbs an hour, which is an ungodly amount. But it's because they need that fuel to keep their muscles moving and firing, and it's no different from us. So again, just fueling and prep is also a really important thing that we work with people here so that they're dialed in and ready.
Yeah, fueling has a huge effect on the intensity you can maintain, whether in a gym or outside on the bike.
Yeah.
So if you're not planning anything around your fueling and you haven't talked to somebody about it, you should, because that can be the difference in your training in the long-term outcomes for sure.
Yeah. So cool. Well, I think that answers most of the great questions we got from everybody. Any closing thoughts, Alex?
No, I think we covered a pretty wide range of topics. Obviously, there are things that we could spend a whole lot more time on and really dive into, but we appreciate you guys tuning in and excited for the future.
Yeah, likewise. And, the winter isn't just for skiing. Skiing's awesome, but think about building your base through the winter so you're not trying to do that last minute catch up on the bike in the spring, and we'd love to work with you on that.
Absolutely.
Have a good one.
Thanks.